Hi guys, welcome to my channel. A big welcome if you're returning. Thank you for returning, and a very warm welcome to you. This is your first time. I hope you will come back another time. My name is Onose, and I make videos about education, career and personal development. In today's video, I will be talking about student accommodation, that is renting a student accommodation, aka halls of residence, be the one that is sponsored by your university or that is rented privately, versus flat sharing, so private renting of apartments, of flats or houses, basically as a student or a young adult in in London. Well, let's get right into today's video. So I'd just like to say that I'll be sharing my personal experiences renting both private halls of residence and halls of residence owned by university, as well as private renting a flat and sharing. The first point that I will want to raise is, if you're a first timer, say maybe you're a fresher, you're an international student, or you're going to be renting for the first time, you may want to consider the most convenient options available to you. So for instance, if you're a student and you're a fresher, you're coming to uni for the very first time, or you're an international student coming to a new country, going to a new city for instance, you may want to consider halls of residence for your first year. This is because you get to meet people in halls of residence, fellow students. It's more convenient, it's more easy. But going further, maybe in your second or third year where you feel more comfortable and you're willing to take on more responsibility, then you can consider renting privately or a private student accommodation. So in this video, I'm going to run through like certain factors and weigh basically the cost benefit analysis of both sides, like renting privately or student accommodation. So like I mentioned before, convenience. The first factor you want to consider is convenience, in terms of how easy will it be for me to get a place, be it a student accommodation or a privately rented house. So for instance, as an international student, I personally think that maybe for your first time moving to a country for the first time, I personally think that getting a student accommodation, a hall of residence for the first year or for the first few months is best, because you settle in more easily in a hall of residence, I believe, than you would privately if you're renting privately, especially if it's a new country or a new city, or if you're pretty young, maybe you're just a young adult starting out, living alone, then you want to consider a soft landing. So why do I say halls of residence? In halls of residence, you basically get everything. Most halls of residence that I know anyway, you get everything in one. So all your bills are included in your payment. You get access to benefits. So sometimes in halls of residence, they have students residential advisors, I think that's what they're called, RAs, who come in to check in on you from time to time. It's easier to report issues and have them fixed because there's the central administration and they basically take care of all of that. So it's easier to report issues, have these issues fixed. Say for instance your heating wasn't working and this is your first time in a new country and probably don't know anyone that works in housing, or maybe a plumber or whoever fixes heaters. I don't even know, are the plumbers or heating companies? Maybe you don't have a clue about how to go about that kind of thing. If you were in a hall of residence, it would be easier because you can just speak to management or just report an issue, and within a day or two, if it's a very if it's a very efficient hall, it will be resolved as soon as possible. So that's one thing you want to consider, the convenience. Also, having all your bills included in one place, you don't have to think about paying separate bills, and it gives you some sort of peace of mind that, oh, all my bills are in one place. I can put on my heating and not have to worry about my bills going up. I can cook and not have to worry about my gas bill or my electricity bill, the likes. Another thing that I will say about halls of residence that maybe makes convenience easier for you is the fact that with halls of residence, I think you just get community, a sense of community. Seeing other students around gives you a sense of like community belonging. You may find yourself in a hall of residence with some of your classmates, and it's easier to reach out to them to ask questions. Just that in-person contact, I guess, than if you were renting privately with strangers, for example. So that's in terms of convenience. Another thing that I will add in terms of ease of getting the place and convenience is with student accommodation, be it privately rented or be it the one sponsored by a university or owned by a university. I think the process of getting a place is relatively easier than if you were renting privately, say for example in London. So renting a student accommodation, you go through your university. In most places, priority is given to international students or students that live outside of the city where the university is located. So you're almost certainly guaranteed a place if you make an application on time, make an application early. So say for example, you're starting uni in January, you shouldn't be looking for an application this December. You should have already found one if it's a student accommodation. There would have been a place available. But if you're making your application late, then you may not get a place. So that is one. On the flip side, okay, another thing to add before I continue is in terms of ease of getting a place for privately rented student accommodation, at least the one I stayed in, they didn't even ask for a visa. They just wanted your passport. They wanted to see like a means of identification, and you didn't even have to show like a valid visa. I remember, I think the one I stayed in London, St. Pancras, I remember I didn't need to show a valid visa. But with your school one, of course, they would have to see your visa, admission, and all of that. But it's an easier process. So now let's talk about renting privately. Maybe say an apartment or a flat sharing situation, or renting a house in London. I think the processes and the hurdles are more for getting a place. So for instance, if you're a student, you will need a guarantor, because they need to be able to be sure that you're able to pay. That was a long-winded sentence. They want to make sure that you're able to make payments as at when due, and if you can't, then you have a guarantor to do that. One thing that I will notice, that I noticed about private renting in London, it is hell trying to get a place, trying to like get an apartment in London. Apartment hunting was crazy compared to when I first rented a student accommodation in London. So maybe it's a personal opinion or just my experiences and experiences of people close to me. I noticed that landlords are not really keen on students, like renting flats and houses and apartments to students. The hurdles are more like, the London market is so competitive. Like there's so much demand for space in London, for living space in London. So you don't have the competitive advantage when you're reaching out to agents, and if you're not a preferred type of customer or a preferred tenant, then your chances of getting a place are slimmer. So I went through a lot of apartments, not many were student friendly, and yeah, that was a challenge. But my first year in London, when I stayed in London last year, was it 2020? Yeah, when I got a place in 2020, within a day or two or a week, like I was actually actively searching, and I just found this place that I wanted to stay in, and you know, I just booked it. Like, it was such an easy process. But that was a privately rented student accommodation, Unite students. Yeah, that was just an easy process. But when I wanted to rent a flat in London, a flat to share with someone else, man, like, we're both students, so it was such a challenge getting a place. They wanted guarantor, some were asking for, when if we didn't have a guarantor, for 12-month payment upfront, some for 6 months payment upfront. So that was quite inconvenient. Of course, they needed to see proof of residence in the country and things like that. So, and then credit checks as well. So more hurdles to pass through if you're going to rent privately than if you were renting a student accommodation, be it a private student accommodation or the one owned by a university. So the second factor for consideration that I'm going to talk about is location. It is so important, especially if you're coming to a new city, or if you're in a city like London. So what is it about location? You want to get a place that is close to your workplace or close to your university. Like, I think that's just rational thinking. So if you're coming to this country for the very first time, and you're going to a city that you've never been to, or you're going to a city that you've never been to before, or it's the case of both, you want to get a place that is relatively close to your student, like it's close to your university or your place of work. if for instance you haven't acclimatized to the cold, you don't want to be walking long distances or having to jump multiple buses and trains to try and get to your location in time. You don't want your commute time to be 1 hour. You don't want your commute time to be, well, 1 hour might be decent. You don't want your commute time to be something you cannot bear, basically. So that's something you should be thinking about. Can I bear the commute of the 1 hour commute? Can I bear the 20 minutes of walking to my university? So location is very important. And speaking of this, one thing that I noticed, not always the case with student accommodations, they try to position it in a place that is makes it easily accessible to go to the university, if that makes sense. Yeah, so they try to position it in a place that is close to the university that the students will be attending. So when I lived in Leicester, my student accommodation was literally 5 minutes walking distance away from uni. So if you stay even in a private student accommodation, it is a student accommodation, so it's designed to be close to the university. So when I was in London and I was in a student accommodation in Unite Students, the one I found was so close to my university at the time, UCL. I would walk 20 minutes to uni, and by the time I moved to London, I had acclimatized to walking long distances. So a 20-minute walk to school wasn't that bad, but with the benefit of hindsight, I think that I could have taken a bus. I don't know why I usually walked to school, but I could walk 20 minutes, max 25 minutes if I wanted to go to main campus. So I think student accommodations are specifically designed to be close to universities, with the exception of 1 or 2, which may be farther away from, like, out of town. But another thing is, the closer the student accommodation is, the more expensive it might be. That's the closer it is to university, but we'll come on to price later. So on the flip side, if you are renting privately, you could have the benefit of renting one so close to your location or your place of work or your place of study. But it could also be that the one that you find that you really like might be farther away. So that's something you need to think about. Like, where is the location? Is it close enough for me? Can I walk 10 minutes? Is 10 minutes too long a time to walk? Is it close to the, if I have to take a bus or take a train, is it close to the bus stop, or is it close to the train station? Or is it the one that I have to walk 20 minutes to the train station and then take a train to my location? Or I can't even get a bus to my location. So these are things that you consider if you're looking for student accommodation or a privately rented accommodation, any type of accommodation. The third factor to consider is price, especially in this London. So while I'll talk about a different city and then London, I've noticed that in other cities, well, if with the exception of a few, maybe say Birmingham, but in cities like Leicester, Hull, in cities that are not like central hubs, or not like central cities like London or Birmingham or big cities, accommodation is cheaper, relatively cheaper. So what I used to pay in Leicester that I thought was a lot, I laugh now compared to what I pay in London, either as a student, either in a student accommodation or a privately rented place. So, but generally, student accommodations, in my opinion, are cheaper than renting privately, but it depends. So if you're in a student accommodation in a place like Leicester, it is relatively cheaper than renting a house if you rent a house by yourself. But the thing is, if you flat share, so if you rent privately and you flat share, you can bring down the cost, and then it could be lesser than student accommodation. But maybe say if you rent privately and you live alone, the cost might be the same, if not more. And it also depends on location. So let's talk about London now. In London, my first time in London was in a private student accommodation, which was in central London, in London St. Pancras, Unite Students. I'll put a picture up of my place at Unite Students. I stayed in a studio. It was so freaking expensive for 1 year. That's literally the money I paid for a year, is literally the international school fees for a year, like the standard international school fees for a year for maybe say a mid-range university. It was quite expensive. But on the flip side, flat sharing in London is cheaper. So when my tenancy was coming to an end in the student accommodation, I knew that I did not want to spend this ridiculous amount of money, you know, renting in London or in central London, that in any case, I wanted to flat share so that I would bring down the cost. So I currently flat share yeah, currently share a flat outside of central London with someone. So the location has changed. And what else? The location has changed. No longer in central London, and I'm no longer in a studio. I'm no longer living alone. I'm sharing. So I think what I pay in a month, or what I paid in a week, in private accommodation, private student accommodation, maybe say I pay, I don't know how to calculate the mass now. I think I pay twice of what I pay in a week in a month here, basically. So I've reduced cost by, say, one, not half, maybe about, not half, about 1/4. So 1/4 of what I've paid in student accommodation, I have reduced the rent by 1/4. That math was not mathing, but I hope you understand. So basically the whole point is I pay less when I share a flat outside of central London than when I live in a student accommodation in central London. And I think it's also the case if you maybe say are living in central London but you're renting a flat with someone else, it will be cheaper. But then another thing that I've noticed is there's more space outside of central London. So when I lived in King's Cross, I'll show you a picture or a video of my studio. It was literally a shoebox size. It was a decent space. I mean, I could move around, you know, decent, not so much cupboard space, but decent bathroom. I actually had a decent, really big bathroom, in my opinion. I had a bed space. My 2 steps from my bed was my table, but it was sort of a shoebox. So where I rent now privately outside central London, I have such a nice big room to myself. Like, it's really spacious, very, very spacious and very modern. So I think for the price, it is really decent. But the only downside is that I have to commute into the city, and my commute, like to go into the city, is about 20 minutes, depending on where I'm going to. So 20 to 30 minutes max. So 20 minutes by tube, in the city. Literally 10 minutes to get to a central location, a more central location, because where I live is more residential. To get to a more central location, about 10 minutes, and 20 minutes I'm in the city, or 20 minutes is actually far, maybe 15 minutes actually I'm in the city. So it's decent, it's like very decent, and it's cheaper than renting a student accommodation in London. And I'm able to do this now because I found someone that I could live with, that's someone I'm comfortable sharing a space with. If not, I would have had to consider living in a studio, but not a student accommodation, or a student accommodation, it depends. But anyways, it would have been more expensive in London. I think outside of London, it could be the same, depending on what type of accommodation you're going for. If it's a studio, if it's sharing, the price range might be similar. But for student accommodation, even sharing I thought was more expensive than private renting here in London. Yeah, I hope that was clear and I hope that made sense. So the fourth point I will be talking about is community. If you're new and you want to build a sort of community, like if you're new to the city, you're new to a country, new to a university, and you want to build a sort of community, then think about the kind of place you want to get for accommodation. If you get a privately rented place, do you have a friend that you can rent with, like someone you've known before who's going to the same uni, or someone who's going to a different uni in the same city? Or will you be renting with strangers? And if you're renting with strangers, what will be the proximity to the people that you have more in common with? Maybe say your classmates, your people in your society, and all of that. So with student accommodation, I noticed that there was a feeling of togetherness. So many student accommodations will have events where students can come in, so the residents in the accommodation can come in and meet together. There will be free food and things like that. So student accommodations usually have these initiatives, and you get to meet people. You can also make friends with your flatmates and people around, and realize, oh, you share a lot in common. Oh, we're in the same building, we go to the same we're doing the same course, we have the same classes, etc. But if you were renting privately with strangers, you may not find that to be the case. It could be that you have nothing in common, or you people are like in different phases of life. So yeah, that's something to consider. What sense of community are you looking for? There was, like, if you're in a student accommodation that's sponsored by a university or that's owned by your university, there's ease. You have your student ID card, you can just show that. If maybe, for instance, you forgot your key, just little 1 or 2 benefits here and there, the things that they'll just make more easy for you. But if you're renting privately, those things, there's more independence, more responsibility. Nobody's going to host a party for the people in your building per se, unless maybe you live in service apartments and they do that type of stuff. But I won't doubt they do like host parties in service apartments. You may not necessarily know the people around you unless you make effort. But with student accommodation, I think there's a sense of community and togetherness that you can sort of feel. Then another point to consider or to build up on what has been said earlier is paying bills. With private renting, so if you're renting a flat or house, unless it's like all bills included service apartments, you would have to be responsible for paying your bills yourself. You would have to call the providers, maybe say the utility suppliers, and say, oh, I've moved in, can I have a new meter reading, I've just moved in now, this is my card, add the bills here and there. Just all those little things you have to organize yourself. So I think renting privately creates a greater sense of responsibility. I remember when I started renting this flat that I currently live in, and it just dawned on me that I would be paying these bills and I have to be responsible for how I use my utilities, like more responsible now that the cost is coming directly out of my pocket, not that I have paid in advance. And it just made me feel like a grown-up. So you have to show that responsibility well, because it can't be the case that you have a bill and you can't pay it. So you have to manage your finances more properly. You need to do the necessary things. If you're a student, you have to get a council tax exemption letter. You have to provide a certificate of studentship, something like that, and send to the relevant local authority to get a council tax exemption. You will have to monitor how you're spending, how you're using electricity. You will have to find a service provider for your Wi-Fi and phone if that's something you're interested in. There are some places that maybe some apartments where the agents will maybe help with this process, but I found that in this place I'm renting, we had to like sort all of that ourselves, from electricity to gas to Wi-Fi, and what other bill do we pay, whatever the bills are. So there's more responsibility in that sense that you have to show, that that's something you need to think about. If things are broken, if you're privately renting, how do you go about that? You need to read your contracts, your agreement, your lease agreement, to see how that works. Would the landlord be responsible for fixing things, or would you have to do that yourself? How much can you do? Like, can you drill into the walls? What can you do? What can you not do? You have to be certain about these things, and it will usually be in your contract. Like, no one will have to read it out to you or spell it out to you. You have to be responsible for that yourself. And the best thing to do is always to ask questions if you're unsure. Another thing that I was going to say is with renting privately, like I earlier mentioned, there's greater responsibility. So I remember that when I was searching for a place, I wanted a fully furnished place. And I got a fully furnished place, quote and unquote, but I realized I still had to do a little bit of work on the place, like the interior, to make it feel homely, I guess. So as you can see, I have Billy bookcases that I got on IKEA. I did a video on that. I'll put in the link in the description box. So I had to buy bookcases or bookshelves, bookshelves for my shoes, for my books and other stuff. So it comes fully furnished per se, but I think they do sort of like the bare minimum that they have to furnish. So anything that you want for your convenience, you will have to go out of your way to get that. So there's greater responsibility in that sense. Just makes you feel grown up, I think, renting privately where everything isn't provided for you. I remember my landlord told us that a microwave was not furniture, that it was an accessory, and we had to get it ourselves, which wasn't too bad. I mean, we got the microwave, got other things. So there are some things that you would just be responsible for getting. Some of the things that you need to feel homely, have to get them yourself. And I guess that applies the same to student accommodation, if you want to go the extra mile to make it feel more homely. So yeah, there's that. And then last but not least, one general point that I would say that applies to all in searching for the right accommodation for you, need to think about things like, how close is it to the grocery stores? How close is it, for example, if you're in London, to the city, if you know you'll be going to the city often? How close is it to food markets that you are going to patronize? How close is it to restaurants that you will eat at? Things that you do every day, for instance. How accessible are those things to you? So personally, when I'm searching for places to live, I don't like walking too unnecessary walking or walking too much. So if I want to maybe say quickly get something from the grocery store, and the nearest grocery store is 15 minutes away, it might seem like a short distance, but I'm just like, no. So you want to find a place that has the nearest convenience for you, like in terms of assessing the things that you access very frequently. Even if there's no big grocery store around you, maybe there's a small convenience store that you can quickly go to purchase things from, especially if you don't own a car and you do a lot of your transportation by walking, catching the bus and the likes. How close is it to the gym that you want to be using? Like, do you have to travel to go to the gym, or is there a nearby gym? So you consider these things. Are you one of these people that like to go out? Maybe you like to eat out, you like to visit the city often. You don't want to be living 1 hour away from the city, and every time you have to go into the city, you're traveling 1 hour to and fro. I mean, that's something to consider, unless maybe say you have to compromise on price or affordability of places. But that's something to think about. What else? How close is it, like I said, to the train stations, to bus stops? Are there any bus stops near where you live, so that in case you have to travel at night and you don't own a car, and you're not going to take maybe a private taxi, that you can have a bus stop so close to you that you can quickly get into your apartment from the bus stop. So if you are a Christian or a Muslim, like how close is it to your place of worship? Is it accessible? How close are you to like your friends? Just all those type of things. Like, is this a good environment to live in? Like, read the reviews. Funny story, I remember when I was apartment hunting in this London, that apartment hunting is such a big task to do, and I came across a place in a city, when we say city or a town in London, in an area in London, and the place looked really nice. Like, it was they had just renovated the apartment. Like, it looked lovely, beautifully furnished, aesthetically pleasing, at least from the pictures. And I just said, let me google the area, and just because I wasn't familiar with the area. And then I noticed that right below the apartment, or beside it, that there's a coffee shop where someone was stabbed recently in that area. And I was just like, wow, does that mean this place is safe or it's not safe? So that kind of, gave me awareness of what I should be looking at. Is this a kind of place that I will walk around in when it's late at night? Is this a place that I'm going to be comfortable living in? Those are things that I would say. And another tip that I would give is, if you're apartment hunting, if you can, check out the place. Like, if you're apartment hunting in London, go and view the places that you're interested in, so you see with your eyes, not that it's only pictures. If you have the opportunity that you can see with your eyes, oh, do I like this area, do I like this environment? Ask questions. Another tip that I would give is, if you're renting in London in particular and you see a place you like, go for it. Like, don't waste your time, because the demand is so high in this place, and the supply may not always be as high. There were many apartments I missed out on because I didn't make an offer soon, because I wanted to check out other options. Although I'm fully happy with where I am now, mostly happy with where I am now, I missed out on other places which would have been closer, maybe say 10 minutes or 5 minutes closer, or 5 minutes less my daily commute, if I had paid a deposit as quickly as possible. So that's an advice that I got that I found really helpful. If you find a place you like, don't waste your time, take it. Just actually take it, put down the deposit at least, so that you start the process of contract exchange and all of that. So yeah, so these are like my top tips and factors to consider when renting either student accommodation or privately renting and sharing with others. I have come to the end of this video. I hope you found it informative and helpful despite my ramblings and the fact that my math was not mathing. I hope you've taken 1 or 2 tips that you can apply as you hunt for apartments or make the decision between student apartments or student accommodation and private renting. If you do have more tips, or if there are things that you think that I have missed, please do drop a comment in the comment section. Like this video if you enjoyed watching it, please, I beg. Share with your friends, especially those who you think will find it helpful, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next. Bye.